A recent Ukrainian strike that killed scores of Russian troops has ignited heavy criticism of Moscow's military leadership and stirred widespread calls for the punishment of top officials. Over the weekend, Ukrainian forces used a US-provided high-mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS, to attack Russian positions in Makiivka, a city with a pre-war population of nearly 350,000 people in eastern Ukraine's occupied Donetsk region. Russia's defense ministry said on Monday that Ukrainian forces fired 6 rockets and that the strikes on Russian positions killed 63 soldiers, state news agency TASS reported. This revelation, some of the details of which have been called into question, was a rare admission from Moscow, where acknowledgement of Russian battlefield losses, setbacks, and failures are few. Ukraine's military has put the death toll at around 400, much higher than the Russian figure, with another 300 troops injured, according to the Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank. These numbers are also disputed. Even if the Russian death toll is on the lower end, several dozen rather than a few hundred, it nonetheless represents a substantial single-event loss and one of Kiev's deadliest attacks on Russian forces since the war began. Western militaries, like the US and UK, have previously estimated that Moscow has suffered at least 100,000 casualties during the bloody affair that has also killed scores of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. Ukraine's HIMARS strike came as Russian forces fired a barrage of Iranian-made suicide drones into Ukraine over a 2-day period, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. Ukraine says that all 84 were shot down by air defense systems. Ukraine says its air defenses managed to knock out all of the suicide drones that Russian forces fired into the country during the New Year holiday period. A senior military official called this defense an unprecedented success. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force said on Tuesday that Russia launched 84 Iranian-made suicide drones on December 31 and January 1, and all of them were downed by Ukrainian air defense forces. 100% were shot down by air defense forces. Such results have never been achieved before, Yuri Ignat told Ukrainian TV, according to state news agency Ukrinform. He said that over the last 4 months, Kiev has shot down 500 drones launched by Russia. Ignat's remarks provided a more precise figure than that offered by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who said on Monday that Ukraine had shot down more than 80 Iranian drones since the beginning of 2023. These ground-based air defense systems arrived in the country in early November, and are the same systems that have been used to shield Washington, D.C. for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, over the last 2 decades. As Ukraine continues to face regular Russian missile and drone attacks, Western partners have been increasingly moving to provide more capable air defenses to shield not only Ukrainian civilian but also the critical infrastructure Russia has repeatedly targeted. It added that over 30 of the suicide drones launched by Russia were shot down over Kiev. One drone that was found in the city after the wave of the attacks had "Happy New Year" written in Russian on it and featured a drawing of a gift. Russia's New Year's Eve and New Year's Day drone barrage came just days after Moscow fired over 120 missiles across Ukraine in what was the biggest wave of attacks that the country had seen in months. With the war on the ground at a standstill, Russia plans to escalate its drone campaign against civilian targets, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian military said it intercepted all 84 unmanned aerial vehicles Russia launched on New Year's Eve and the night of January 1, spilling into the morning of January 2. The Iranian-made Shahid drones that played such a crucial role in the Kremlin's strategy to batter Ukraine's energy infrastructure have become considerably less effective thanks in part to US-supplied air defense weapons and the Ukrainians' ability to learn how to use them. Ukraine has shot down almost 500 drones since September, the country's Air Force spokesman, Yuri Ignat, said on television Tuesday. Zelensky calls those achievements victories over terrorists and terror. 2 top Ukrainian officials, Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov and Kirilo Budanov, head of the Intelligence Directorate, have warned that Russia plans to hold another draft early this month. For the first time in the war, Ukraine has filed charges against 2 Russian officers directly related to attacks on residential areas and civilian infrastructure. Sergei Kobylash, commander of Russia's long-range aviation force, and Igor Osipov, the former head of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, are unlikely to stand trial for the charges in the near future. Ukraine has reclaimed 40% of the territory Russia seized since the beginning of the war, Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhnyi said, according to the Kyiv Independent. By repelling the latest round of drone strikes, Ukraine denied Russian President Vladimir Putin a rallying point as his forces are reeling from a rocket attack that killed at least 63 soldiers at barracks in Makiivka, a town in the partially Russian-occupied eastern Donetsk region. Instead, images from an Associated Press video in Makiivka showed 5 cranes and emergency workers removing big chunks of concrete following the attack, apparently executed last weekend with US-provided HIMARS rocket launchers, according to a Russian Defense Ministry statement. The assault, one of the deadliest and most embarrassing for the Kremlin since the war began, renewed criticism about Russia's military campaign. Such profound military failures will continue to complicate Putin's efforts to appease the Russian pro-war community and retain the dominant narrative in the domestic information space, said the Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank. Mourners gather to lay flowers in memory of more than 60 Russian soldiers that Russia says were killed in a Ukrainian strike on Russian-controlled territory, in Samara, on January 3, 2023. Russia on January 2 said more than 60 soldiers were killed in a Ukrainian strike on Russian-controlled territory in a New Year assault, the biggest loss of life reported by Moscow so far. Kyiv took responsibility for the strike, which it said took place in the occupied city of Makiivka in eastern Ukraine on New Year's Eve. The killed soldiers were mobilized mainly from the Samara region. The strike, in the occupied city of Makiivka, is the biggest loss of life reported by Moscow so far. Battlefield losses have done little to alter the military plans for Russia, which still envisions capturing all the Donetsk province and using the Donbass region as its land corridor to occupied Crimea, a Ukrainian spokesman told media members. Chernyak said Ukraine's military intelligence estimates Russia may lose up to 70,000 troops in the war over the next 4 to 5 months. Ukraine's rocket and artillery forces launched 13 attacks on the areas of concentration of Russian troops in the past 24 hours, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces. In their January 3 update, the General Staff also reported that the Russian army launched at least 6 missiles, 52 airstrikes and over 70 MLRS attacks against Ukraine. All missile attacks were targeted at civilian infrastructure. Ukrainian forces also downed Russian Ka-52 helicopter, 27 Iranian-made Shahid-136 kamikaze drones and repelled Russian attacks near 13 settlements in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. The toll from a Ukrainian New Year strike in Makiivka has risen to 89, Moscow said Wednesday, after Russians gathered to mourn the troops in a rare public display of anger and grief. Russia said on Monday that 63 troops had been killed, the biggest loss of life from a single strike reported by Moscow since the start of the offensive in February. Ukraine struck a temporary base in Makiivka at 12:01 a.m. local time on January 1, using US-supplied HIMARS rocket systems, Sevryakov said. Russian President Vladimir Putin had just delivered his traditional New Year's address. The Kremlin chief hailed "our heroes" fighting in Ukraine and declared that historical rightness is on our side. Ukraine has taken responsibility for the strike and said the toll could be much higher. Russian war correspondents said many of the victims were reservists recently mobilized into the army. Some 200 people laid roses and wreaths in a central square in the city of Samara as an Orthodox priest recited a prayer. Russian strikes had also destroyed 4 more HIMARS launchers and killed 200 Ukrainian and foreign mercenaries in the town of Drushkivka in the eastern region of Donetsk, he said. Russian war correspondents have accused Russia's top commanders of not learning from past mistakes and seeking to shift the blame on the troops. But much of the criticism was focused on the incompetence of Russia's top brass and not President Vladimir Putin, who sent troops to Ukraine on February 24 last year. Ukraine said it had faced waves of Russian drone and missile attacks since New Year's Eve, mainly targeting energy and other critical infrastructure. On Tuesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he had spoken by phone with the leaders of Britain, Norway, and the Netherlands and pointed to the risks of escalation on the front. The hardest fighting is raging around the city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, a location with little strategic importance that Russian forces led by the mercenary group Wagner have been trying to capture for months. In a rare admission of battlefield losses, Russia's defense ministry said Monday that a Ukrainian missile strike on the occupied city of Makiivka early January 1 killed 63 Russian troops, later revising the number upward to 70 as debris was cleared from the raised vocational school in Donetsk province. Ukraine's armed forces initially said about 400 Russian soldiers were killed and another 300 wounded in Makiivka, but later said Russian losses are still be assessed. Russian military bloggers put the number of dead at between 200 and 600, and many furiously accused Russia's military of lethal incompetence, the New York Times reports. None of the claimed casualty counts could be independently verified, but even the lowest number would represent one of the worst Russian losses in a single episode in the war, and a grave embarrassment for Russian President Vladimir Putin. One influential war analyst, Igor Gherkin, wrote on Telegram that many hundreds were dead in Makiyivka and many more remained under the rubble. Like many military bloggers, he slammed Russia's military for housing large number of troops in one location, within HIMARS range, in a building that also stored ammunition without the slightest sign of disguise. Vladlen Tatarsky, a military blogger embraced by the Kremlin, described Russia's top officers as untrained cretins and called for their trial before a tribunal. One of the Russian conscripts who survived the attack reportedly wrote that the official death toll of 63 is way too low, saying of his dead colleagues, "We are cleaning their brains off our boots." The Institute for the Study of War said Monday night it could recall only 2 other instances of mass milblogger criticism: the failed Russian river crossing in Bilohorivka in May 2022 and the botched Russian offensive operation on Pavlivka in October 2022. Such profound military failures will continue to complicate Putin's efforts to appease the Russian pro-war community and retain the dominant narrative in the domestic information space. Ukraine's armed forces have liberated 40% of land Russia occupied after the beginning of its full-scale invasion on February 24 and 28% of all Russian-occupied territories of the country, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhnyi wrote on January 2. Zaluzhnyi's Telegram post summarized the achievements of 2022, the year that went down in world history under the name of Ukraine and its armed forces. Ukraine continues to deter Russian attacks on a land area with a total length of 3,786 kilometers, including an active front line of 1,500 kilometers, according to the chief commander. International instructors trained over 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers in 2022, and such training is currently taking place in 17 European countries, Zaluzhnyi reported. More than 1,000 wounded servicemen were sent for treatment and rehabilitation abroad. The head of the Ukrainian army wrote that more than 600,000 civilians were evacuated from the areas of hostilities last year, and over 2 million tons of humanitarian goods were brought there. Ukraine's armed forces also examined thousands of kilometers of territory for mines and shells and destroyed 41,800 dangerous objects, according to Zaluzhnyi. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said allies are pushing to strengthen the alliance's target of spending 2% of output on defense, with the aim of reaching an agreement by July. Ukraine warned that Russia may launch more attacks over the Orthodox Christmas holiday later this week, even as Kyiv continued to down Iran-made Shahid drones being sent into the country, the nation's Air Defense Command said on Monday. Germany, meanwhile, is open to using billions of euros in frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine rebuild as long as legal issues can be resolved and allies follow suit, according to people familiar with the discussions. 2 people died and 9 were injured in Kherson and the region due to Russian attacks, Governor Yaroslav Yanushevich said on Telegram. Ukraine's air defense systems intercepted every drone from 2 consecutive nights of Russian strikes since December 31, according to the Institute for the Study of War. But 2 Russian Iskander missiles hit the town of Drushkivka in the Donetsk region, killing 1 person and damaging the local ice arena as well as residential and industrial buildings, Kyrylo Tymoshenko, the deputy head of Ukraine's presidential office, said in a video on Telegram. Valery Zaluzhnyi, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, said he updated U.S. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, on the operational and strategic situation, in a phone call. Russian President Vladimir Putin plans to hold talks with his Turkish counterpart, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, on Wednesday, Interfax reported, citing Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak spoke with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky by phone, pledging long-term support for Kyiv. The commitment was demonstrated by the recent delivery of 1,000 anti-air missiles, Sunak's office said in an emailed readout. Cargoes bound for China, India and Turkey, which have become a lifeline for Russian supplies displaced from Europe, saw a 3rd straight drop. The country's overall seaborne flows fell by 117,000 barrels a day to 2.615 million barrels on a 4-week average basis. Germany is open to using billions of euros in frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine rebuild as long as legal issues can be resolved and allies follow suit. Chancellor Olaf Scholz's government supports Ukraine's demand for war reparations but hasn't yet taken an official position on seizing assets from the Russian state. The issue is complex and some parts of the ruling coalition are more ardent than others, according to people familiar with the discussions. Some North Atlantic Treaty Organization members want the alliance to sharpen its target of every member spending 2% of output on defense by making the guideline a minimum, according to Secretary General Stoltenberg. In 2014, NATO agreed that members whose military spending was below 2% would aim to move toward the goal within a decade, yet more than half remain well below. We will meet, we will have ministerial meetings, we will have talks in capitals, Stoltenberg said in an interview with German news agency DPA, adding that the aim is to seal agreement no later than the next NATO summit in Vilnius in July. Moscow plans a protracted drone attack on Ukraine to exhaust the country's energy infrastructure, air defenses, and people, according to President Zelensky. Ukraine's anti-missile forces have intercepted more than 80 Iran-made drones launched by Russia against the power grid and civilian infrastructure since the beginning of the year, and many more are yet to come, Zelensky said in his nightly address to the nation on Monday. More than 1 million Russians have called, texted or visited the website of a Ukrainian hotline that allows them to surrender, with many seeking a way to avoid going to war, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, according to the hotline. The hotline, which is run by the I Want to Live project, has received about 200 to 300 daily calls since September, said Vitaly Matvienko, the project spokesperson. Instead of calling, some Russians choose to send encrypted messages via Telegram. Altogether, more than 4,000 people have submitted requests to surrender, he said. The woman sounds like she's almost in tears as she says her son received a summons to the army at a police checkpoint. The woman asks what she could do. The operator's advice was to call the hotline once her son was in Ukraine-controlled territory. Then they could assess whether he might be able to surrender. At the agreed-upon time, the soldier has to come to the Ukrainian armed forces positions and establish visual contact with a drone, which will show the safe passage route. The Russians who follow the surrender rules are legally considered prisoners of war, Ukrainian authorities said. That status guarantees they are treated according to the Geneva Conventions and they can receive necessary medical treatment and food. They can also call their relatives. Leaders of the project said they expect to continue expanding, with plans for a separate program in Ukraine and abroad for members of Russia's officer corps who are seeking to surrender. Ukrainian officials said they're busy putting together a new program for high-level defectors, some of whom will be given new identifiers and backgrounds. That programs will be implemented on a case-by-case basis, officials said. Podolyak said the decision to hold the summit in Ukraine's capital was symbolic, and noted that by making steps like these, Europe emphasizes that it is with Ukraine based on principles, and will stay by its side until the end of the war. This summit clearly indicates that Russia represents the past for Europe, while Ukraine is a path towards the present and the future, said Podolyak. And everything will be done to ensure that Ukraine is integrated into Europe as quickly as possible, financially, economically, as well as in terms of cross-border cooperation, military solidarity, and so on. Podolyak added that this is also a signal for Russia to forget about ending the war on its own terms. On January 2, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke with the head of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen. The leaders agreed to move the February 3 Ukraine-EU summit from Brussels to Kyiv. According to the head of the EU delegation to Ukraine Matti Masikas, the event will include discussions of Ukraine's EU membership. Serhiy Haidai, the head of Luhansk Oblast, has said that the Kremenets-Vadov highway is under the fire control of the Ukrainian defenders and now the logistics of the Russian invaders have become much more complicated. Near occupied Luhansk, kilometer-long queues of trucks with shells, which are brought closer to the front line, are reloaded to military KAMAZ trucks and then delivered directly to the front. The head of the Oblast Military Administration also thanked the soldiers of the 92nd Brigade, which gave the invaders a spark in Svatov. Haidai said that the Russians were on the verge of a nervous breakdown, because they were repressing the local population of the occupied territories, suspecting people of collaborating with the armed forces of Ukraine. The Kremenets-Vadov highway on the front line in Luhansk Oblast connects two temporarily occupied cities. In October, Ukrainian defenders already took the road under fire control. The ISW says such profound military failures will continue to complicate Russian dictator Vladimir Putin's efforts to appease the Russian pro-war community and retain the dominant narrative in the domestic information space. The ISW commented on Russia's announced version that DNR law enforcement officials had told Russian state wires that the strike occurred when Russian servicemen violated operational security by using personal cell phones, allowing Ukrainian forces to conduct a precision strike at the base. Kremlin-leaning outlets and some military bloggers amplified the claim, stating that Russian forces should not underestimate the Ukrainian ability to exploit poor OPSEC practices on the front lines and called on the Kremlin to introduce stricter guidelines on cell phone use among servicemen. However, Wagner-affiliated milbloggers stated that Russian military command had made it easy for the Ukrainian forces to strike several hundred servicemen in one location, calling the DNR explanation of cell phone usage a lie. A former Russian officer had also stated that Russian forces stored ammunition in the school's basement, enabling the devastating strike. Other milbloggers stated that the Russian command witnessed similar strikes throughout the past 11 months but were criminally negligent and failed to disperse the Russian forces quartered in Makiyivka into smaller groups further in the rear. Several milbloggers referred to a Putin statement about the necessity for the MOD to take accountability and listen to criticism on December 21 while calling on the Kremlin to punish the commander responsible for the OPSEC failures. ISW previously reported on two other instances of mass milblogger criticism: the failed Russian river crossing in Bilohorivka in May 2022 and the botched Russian offensive operation on Pavlivka in October 2022. The Strategic Communications Department of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported on January 1 that the Ukrainian military hit the building of Vocational School No. 19 in Russia-occupied Makiyivka late on New Year's Eve. Around 400 Russian soldiers were reportedly killed and another 300 wounded in the strike. The Russian MOD acknowledged the strike, claiming that 4 of the 6 rockets killed only 63 Russian servicemen. Global insurers face a testing 2023 as reinsurers hike rates on key business lines by as much as 200% from January 1 and pull back from underwriting risk in Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, reinsurance brokers' reports showed on Tuesday. Reinsurers insure insurers, and January 1 is the most important date for reinsurers to renew and adjust pricing of 12-month policies in light of major economic or geopolitical changes, such as the war in Ukraine which broke out in February. Reinsurers have suffered sharp losses from the conflict and from natural catastrophes such as Hurricane Ian in Florida, which broker Houghton described as the second most expensive natural catastrophe ever in terms of insured losses. Reinsurers are cutting their exposure to U.S. hurricane risk, with U.S. property reinsurance rates rising by as much as 150% in worst-hit areas at January 1, Gallagher Re said in a separate report. Aviation reinsurance rates, heavily impacted by hundreds of stranded aircraft in Russia, rose by as much as 200%, Gallagher Re said. Hurricane Ian and other natural catastrophes caused an estimated $115 billion of insured losses globally last year, well above the 10-year average of $81 billion, reinsurer Swiss Re estimated last month. Climate change is partly to blame for the increased losses, industry sources say.